I'd like to welcome all of you to our first Politics, Law, and Economics lecture of the 2010-2011 academic year. The Politics, Law, and Economics lecture series is designed to highlight the three institutions which must exist in order to support and defend a free civil society. Those institutions are good governance, the rule of law, and market-based institutions. Our speaker this evening is Mr. Doug Bandow. He is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. He is also a nationally syndicated columnist with the Copley News Service and is the former editor of Inquiry magazine. He also served as an assistant to President Reagan and as a senior policy analyst in the Office of the President-elect and the Reagan for President campaign. He's also been widely published in such periodicals as Foreign Policy, Harper's, National Interest, the National Review, the New Republic, and Orbis, as well as leading newspapers including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. He has also made numerous television and radio appearances, most notably ABC Nightly News, the CBS Evening News, CNN Crossfire, CNN Larry King Live, Good Morning America, Nightline, and the Oprah Winfrey Show. He's also written numerous books, the most recent of which is Foreign Follies, America's New Global Empire. Tonight, he is here to discuss with us the intersection between foreign policy and the ideas of liberty. So please join me in a welcome back to Buies Creek, Mr. Doug Bandow.
Thanks, Derek. It's a great pleasure to be here, to come back. Appreciate all of you coming here. It's been a very nice day, so your willingness to give up your evening, I very much appreciate. We're going to talk about foreign policy. You know, we're in election season, and most of the issues that are being discussed are economics. Traditionally, American politics revolves around economics. Bill Clinton ran for office in 1992 and talked about, his mantra was, "It's the economy, stupid." You know, George H.W. Bush might be, won that Iraq war, but who cares? We're back to the real issues that motivate Americans. But I think we recognize that as much as economics matters today, we're in a recession, we still have lots of concerns over debts and deficits, reform issues, financial reform, health care, all sorts of things are on the table. Nevertheless, foreign policy is very important. We're still involved in two wars, one of which is declining, Iraq. Nevertheless, we have tens of thousands of troops still on station there. We have an expanding war in Afghanistan. We have talk of other wars, talk of war against Iran, questions of what we're going to do against North Korea, questions of dealing with China over the long term, all sorts of issues out there that are extraordinarily important. While obviously terrorism remains very much on people's minds. But it may, it's not exactly a war, but it's conflict, and it ties into wars. So all of these issues, I think, show the importance of foreign policy as an issue for the American people. I would argue that Americans' kind of a U.S. military strategy and foreign policy were pretty much outmoded even before 9/11. Now that we had, at the end of the Cold War, which had become a central feature of American foreign policy for decades, we had a foreign policy and military force structure that was created for a different age. I think 9/11 really showed, how outmoded that policy was. That we'd gone through a period after the fall of the Berlin Wall with lots of discussions about new missions, what to do with NATO, what to do in this new world, and yet we found ourselves on September 11th, 2001, where it turned out we were far better able to intervene overseas than to protect ourselves. That at a time where America really needed defending, it turns out we had trouble defending ourselves. And what we've done since then, of course, is create a new department, the Department of Homeland Security. And the real question to my mind is, well, what is the Department of Defense? I mean, isn't the Department of Defense for defending America? If it's not, then what is it for? Why do we need a separate department for defending the United States? So I think the question today is, what should policy be? It's a very good time for a question to ask about new policy. And I think we need to think about policy in terms of what should a democratic republic do? What should a country that's built upon limited government, that protects individual liberties do? What kind of a foreign policy is most consistent with that kind of a vision of a nation? A republic rather than an empire. What kind of a foreign policy best fits our nation today? For about a half century, foreign policy was easy in America. It was containment. It was built around dealing with the Soviet Union, what Ronald Reagan called, I think correctly, the evil empire. I mean, the Soviet Union was a monstrous place. Tens of millions of people had been murdered by it. It extended its control throughout Eastern Europe, created client states around the globe, allied with many very ugly forces around the world, ruled by ruthless people like Joseph Stalin. This was an evil empire. And they were basically coming out of World War II. The United States created a set of alliances around the world, most notably NATO, but also alliances with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia and New Zealand, called ANZUS. Created a set of alliances, created hundreds of bases around the world, placed American troops around the world in an attempt to stop the Soviet Union and Maoist China from expanding. You know, what we had here are two very serious communist powers, very dangerous communist powers, countries that in fact murdered millions of people. And for the most part, from 1949 through 1989, you know, more or less, that was what American foreign policy was all about. And you obviously had debates in the United States about policy. You had debates over the Vietnam War. You had debates over military spending and weapons. Nevertheless, there was a general consensus that American foreign policy was focused on stopping this kind of force that was out there. Where basically Moscow was viewed as a central puppeteer. You know, that in a sense almost anything around the world mattered because it was connected back to the Soviet Union. You were worried about struggling for influence in Zaire because if we didn't get Zaire's cobalt, the Soviets would. You know, we're concerned about Central America because, or you know, Cuba's allied with the Soviet Union. We worry about Cuba, particularly because of that military relationship. So in a sense, the U.S. felt its need to be all over, involved in third world countries, involved with relationships with some very ugly countries at times, Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines and a lot of others. But this really animated American foreign policy. And while it was tough, it was costly, it was hard, there was a simplicity about it. I mean, the focus was, you know, kind of preventing the spread of hegemonic communism. Then 1989 happens. Now, for most of you, 1989 doesn't really exist as a memory. And indeed, kind of growing up in a world in which people worried about a Warsaw Pact NATO confrontation in Europe. I mean, we actually thought about Soviet tanks pouring through the Fulda Gap in Germany. I mean, American school children at one point were taught to get under desks if nuclear war happens, you know, protect themselves from the fallout. I mean, Americans had a conception of civilization could be destroyed. We could have nuclear war. We could have another massive war in Europe, you know, kind of a la World War II with armored divisions and infantry divisions and everything. I mean, that was a vision for decades, a fear of what could happen in terms of conflict. Well, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. I mean, there's a cascade of all the Eastern European dictatorships disappear. And suddenly we're left in a world where, as Gertrude Stein said of Oakland, there's no there there. There's no Soviet Union. China's no longer Maoist. The Eastern European countries, once satellites of Moscow, are now rushing to embrace the West. They want to join NATO. They want to get away from their old allies. You know, the risk of conflict is suddenly, as the world looks dramatically different. You know, and that's the world we're in today then. We're left with kind of a foreign policy and military structure that was created in this other world. We still have 1,000 bases overseas, a huge military, lots of military spending, yet that threat environment has changed dramatically. You know, there is no Red Army to worry about anymore. China's not a substitute. Terrorism is evil and awful, but it's not the same thing. So the question is what to do now in this world. And I think it's important to recognize in thinking about foreign policy the costs of foreign policy. You know, there's a tendency when one wants to kind of be active around the world, one thinks of all the great things America can do, without thinking about a lot of the costs that naturally come with that. The first thing to recognize is a military budget is the price of your foreign policy. If you're going to have an active foreign policy, you have to have military assets to back it up. The worst thing you can do is make lots of promises around the world and then not be able to pay them off.